How dare you hover around my table like you belong here? Victoria's voice sliced through the ballroom as her red-painted nails dug into the waitress's uniform and ripped, the sound of tearing fabric echoing like a gunshot, as gasps erupted from every corner. But when the most dangerous man in the room stepped out of the shadows and asked in a voice cold enough to stop hearts,
"For what reason did you just lay your hands on my wife?"
"For what reason did you just lay your hands on my wife?" The woman in red realized she'd just humiliated the one person she couldn't afford to touch. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and comment what time it is that you're watching this video. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's begin. The tension cracked through the chandelier-lit dining room of Le Monarque like shattered porcelain. Heads turned, silverware paused mid-air. A blonde woman in a scarlet gown stood from her chair, eyes narrowed like twin blades, one manicured hand pointing directly at the waitress in blue. "You're just a server," she hissed, her voice dripping with practiced cruelty. "Don't think that uniform makes you important." Her voice carried through the domed ceiling, past the golden sconces, to the velvet-draped corners of the hall. Imani Carter stood motionless, tray balanced in her hand, her brown skin glowing in the candlelight, dark hair pinned back neatly. She didn't flinch. Her eyes held steady. But Victoria Hale wasn't finished. With a theatrical flourish, she reached forward, her red-painted nails digging into the cotton of Imani's shirt, and ripped. The tear was loud, obscene, brutal. The front of the blue uniform peeled open, revealing a white undershirt beneath. Gasps spread like wildfire. A glass shattered somewhere in the background. "She thinks she's somebody," Victoria sneered, stepping back as if Imani's presence contaminated the air. "You're nothing." Silence swallowed the room whole. Then a man stepped forward, from the edge of the stairwell near the back, where the shadows were deepest. Damien Hale emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, tattooed, every inch of him draped in quiet danger. His eyes locked on the scene like a slow-burning fuse meeting open flame. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "For what reason?" he asked, low and sharp. "Did you just lay your hands on my wife?" The crowd's silence deepened, the weight of those final two words, "my wife," slamming into the air like a guillotine. Victoria blinked, blood draining from her face. "She's what?" But Imani remained still, her dignity untouched, even with her uniform in shreds. She didn't need to say a word. The man who ruled the room had already spoken for her. What no one in that gilded ballroom had known, not the society elites sipping champagne, not the whispering staff, and certainly not the woman in the red dress, was that the woman they dismissed as a nobody had been married to the most powerful man in that room for months. And tonight, the truth had finally stepped out of the shadows. Earlier that evening, the night had begun like many others in Damien Hale's world. Tailored suits, high-stakes conversations, and whispers behind wine glasses. But for Imani Carter, it was never just another night. Underneath the uniform, Behind the patient smile was a woman who had learned long ago how to survive in silence, and why it was finally time to stop. She had arrived at Le Monarque 3 hours before the gala's first guest. The service entrance smelled of fresh linen and expensive cologne. Other servers rushed past her, adjusting bow ties and rehearsing wine pairings. No one recognized her. That was the point. Damien had asked her to do this. Not ordered. Asked. "I need eyes I can trust," he'd told her that morning, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw as they stood in the private study of their hidden apartment across the city. "Victoria's been erratic, meeting with people she shouldn't. Saying things that make my associates nervous." Imani had tilted her head, studying him. "You think she'll do something tonight?" "I think she's desperate," Damien said quietly. "And desperate people make mistakes." So Imani had agreed. Not because she was obedient, but because she understood the world her husband moved through, a world where loyalty was currency and perception could kill faster than a bullet. She knew what it meant to be married to a man like Damien Hale. The secrecy wasn't shame, it was survival. Their marriage had been quiet. No fanfare, no society page announcement. Just the two of them in a courthouse on a rainy Tuesday, his hand warm around hers, her voice steady as she spoke vows that meant more than any crowd ever could. He had wanted to protect her. She had wanted to protect him, too. Now, hours later, Imani moved through the ballroom with the grace of someone who had long ago mastered the art of being seen without being noticed. She refilled glasses. She smiled politely. She listened. And she saw everything. Victoria Hale held court at the center table, draped in red like a warning sign. Her laughter was too loud. Her gestures too sharp. She drank quickly, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for something or someone to validate her. Imani recognized that look. It was the look of a woman clinging to relevance. She had seen it before, in the women who sneered at her in boutiques, who clutched their purses tighter when she walked past, who assumed her worth could be measured by the color of her skin or the modesty of her clothes. But Imani had never needed their validation. She had learned young that strength didn't announce itself. It didn't need a spotlight. Her mother had taught her that, working double shifts as a nurse, raising 2 daughters alone, never once bowing her head to anyone who tried to make her feel small. "Let them underestimate you, baby," her mother used to say. "That's when you move." So Imani moved. She watched. She waited. And when Victoria's eyes finally landed on her with that familiar contempt, Imani didn't look away. Across the room, Damien stood in the shadowed alcove near the stairwell, a glass of bourbon untouched in his hand. He wasn't a man who drank when he needed clarity. And tonight, he needed clarity. He watched his wife, though no one else in the room knew to call her that, navigate the space with the quiet confidence that had first drawn him to her. She didn't perform. She didn't preen. She simply existed, fully and unapologetically, in a world that constantly told women like her they didn't belong. It infuriated him that she had to hide. Not because of danger alone, though there was always danger in his line of work, but because the world she'd been forced to move through had trained her to make herself smaller, quieter, less visible. She deserved to be seen. Damien's jaw tightened as his gaze shifted to Victoria. His wife in name only now. A relic of a different life. A different version of himself. One who had believed image mattered more than integrity. He had been young when he married Victoria, ambitious, hungry for power in a world that demanded you take it or be devoured. She had been beautiful, connected. The kind of woman men in his circle were expected to have on their arm. But beauty without substance rotted quickly. Over the years, he had watched her become cruel, petty, reckless. She wielded her status like a weapon, carving into anyone she perceived as beneath her. And lately, she'd been carving deeper, making alliances with rivals, whispering in ears that didn't belong to her, testing the boundaries of his patience. He had tolerated it, for the sake of appearances, for the sake of peace. But tonight, something in him had shifted. He saw the way Victoria's eyes tracked Imani across the room. The way her lips curled with disdain, the way her fingers twitched, as if itching to lash out. And Damien realized with cold, crystalline certainty she was going to make a scene. When Victoria stood, when her voice sliced through the ballroom like a blade, Damien didn't move. Not yet. He watched Imani's face, calm, unshaken. Even when Victoria's hand shot forward and tore the fabric of her uniform, Imani didn't flinch, didn't fight, didn't give Victoria the satisfaction of a reaction. And in that moment, Damien made his choice. He had spent months protecting Imani by keeping her hidden. But silence had its cost, too. It was time the world knew exactly who she was. He stepped forward, his voice low and lethal. "For what reason did you just lay your hands on my wife?" The words didn't echo. They landed, and everything changed. Victoria Hale had built her entire life on being seen. At 17, she'd been scouted outside a coffee shop in Brooklyn. Her height and bone structure enough to pull her out of a cramped apartment she shared with 3 roommates. By 19, she was walking runways in Milan. By 23, she'd graced the cover of Vogue. But modeling had an expiration date, and Victoria had always been smart enough to know it. So when Damien Hale walked into that charity auction 8 years ago, young, hungry, dangerous in a way that made her pulse quicken, she'd made her move. She'd worn red that night, too. Red always worked. He'd noticed her across the room, and she'd made sure he kept noticing. 3 months later, they were married. She'd thought she'd won. For years, it had felt like winning. She had the name, the house, the status. She had become Victoria Hale, a woman people whispered about, feared, envied. She had learned to wield her position like a scepter, to cut down anyone who dared question her place at the top. But somewhere along the way, the man who had given her that name stopped looking at her the way he once had. And tonight, standing in the ruins of her own making, Victoria finally understood what losing felt like. The words still rang in her ears. My wife. Not her. Not Victoria. Someone else. That waitress. Victoria's hands trembled as she stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, every eye on her, every mouth slightly open in shock. The humiliation burned hotter than anything she'd ever felt, hotter than stage lights, hotter than camera flashes, hotter than the shame of being told at 29 that she was aging out of the industry. Damien's eyes were on her now, cold and unforgiving. Not the man who had once pulled her close in the back of limousines, who had whispered promises against her skin. This was the man the streets feared, the man whose word could end lives. And he had just ended hers. She turned and walked. Not ran. Victoria Hale did not run, but walked with her head high, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The valet brought the car around without a word. No one dared speak to her. She slid into the back of the black limousine, and the door closed with a soft, final click. Only then did the mask crack. Victoria stared at her reflection in the tinted window as the car pulled away from Le Monarque. Her makeup was still perfect. Her hair still gleamed. The dress still clung to every curve. But none of it mattered anymore. She had seen the signs. She had felt them. For months now, Damien had been pulling away, staying late at the office, taking calls in other rooms, his touch growing perfunctory when it came at all. She'd told herself it was business, stress, the weight of running an empire. But deep down, she'd known. The first time she'd seen the way he looked at her, at Imani, had been 3 weeks ago. Victoria had arrived unannounced at one of Damien's properties, a renovated brownstone he claimed was used for business meetings. She'd let herself in with the spare key she wasn't supposed to have, heels sharp against the hard wood. And she'd seen them. Not touching, not kissing, just talking. Imani had been sitting on the arm of a leather chair, dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, her natural hair falling in soft coils around her shoulders. She'd been laughing at something Damien said, her head tilted back, her smile unguarded and real. And Damien had been looking at her like she was the only person in the world. Victoria had frozen in the hallway, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that look. She'd had it once, years ago, before she'd become a trophy, before she'd become a title. That look was devotion. She'd left before they noticed her, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She'd driven home and poured herself a drink, then another, trying to drown the image of them together. So easy, so natural, so right, in a way she and Damien hadn't been in years. She'd told herself she was being paranoid, but paranoia had a way of proving itself true. Victoria's fingers curled into fists against the leather seat. She had done everything right. She had played the role perfectly. The elegant wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who looked stunning on his arm at every event. She had made herself indispensable. Or so she'd thought. But Imani hadn't played a role at all. She'd simply been quiet, composed, unbothered by the weight of expectation or the need to perform. And somehow, that had been enough. More than enough. Victoria's jaw tightened, her nails digging into her palms. She had seen Imani at the gala tonight, moving through the room in that ridiculous server's uniform, and something inside her had snapped. The way Imani held herself, calm, dignified, as if she belonged there despite the apron and tray, had felt like an insult. "You don't belong here," Victoria had wanted to scream. "You're nobody." So she'd made sure everyone else saw it too. She'd ripped that uniform, tore it open in front of everyone, because if she could humiliate Imani, if she could reduce her to nothing in front of the people who mattered, then maybe Damien would remember who his real wife was. But the plan had backfired. Spectacularly. Because Damien hadn't defended Victoria. He hadn't pulled her aside with a quiet warning or a sharp word. He had claimed Imani. Publicly. Irrevocably. And in doing so, he had erased Victoria completely. The limo slowed to a stop outside the Hale estate. Her estate, she wanted to scream, though she knew better. Nothing had ever really been hers, not the house, not the name, not the man. Victoria stared at the mansion through the window, its windows glowing like eyes in the dark. She had clawed her way into this world, fought tooth and nail to stay in it. She wasn't going to let some waitress take it from her. Not without a fight. Her reflection stared back at her. Beautiful, poised, perfect, and seething. "This isn't over," she whispered to the glass. The car door opened. She stepped out into the night, her red dress trailing behind her like blood. Imani Carter had learned to be invisible long before she ever met Damien Hale. She'd grown up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where survival meant keeping your head down and your guard up. The kind of neighborhood where sirens were lullabies and corner stores had bulletproof glass. Her mother worked night shifts at the hospital, double shifts when the bills piled too high, leaving Imani to raise her younger sister, Zara, in a 2-bedroom apartment that always smelled like bleach and hope. She'd been 12 when she learned what it meant to be seen as a threat simply for existing. The security guard at the bookstore had followed her through every aisle, his eyes tracking her like she was already guilty. She'd had $7 in her pocket, saved from weeks of helping neighbors carry groceries, and a list of books for a school project. She'd bought one paperback and left with her head high, her hands shaking. "Don't let them make you small," her mother had said that night, brushing Imani's hair with steady hands. "You're going to walk into rooms that don't want you there. But you belong anywhere you decide to stand." So Imani had stood. She'd earned a scholarship to NYU, worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't, graduated with honors while sending money home to make sure Zara had new shoes and textbooks, and a chance at something better. She'd walked into corporate boardrooms where she was the only black face at the table, where colleagues assumed she was the assistant, not the analyst, where her ideas were dismissed until a white man repeated them verbatim. She'd survived it all with grace that looked soft, but was forged in steel. And she had never, not once asked for anyone's permission to exist. She'd met Damien on a Tuesday, not at a gala, not at some high society function, at a community center in Bed-Stuy, where Imani volunteered teaching financial literacy to single mothers every week. He'd walked in wearing jeans and a plain black t-shirt. No entourage, no fanfare. He'd told the coordinator he wanted to donate, but he wanted to see where the money was going first. Imani had been in the middle of explaining compound interest to a room of tired, hopeful women when she'd noticed him leaning against the back wall, arms crossed, watching. After the session, he'd approached her. "You're good at this," he'd said simply. "It's not hard when you care," she'd replied, stacking her papers. He'd smiled. Not the practiced smile of someone performing charm, but something genuine. Most people don't. They'd talked for an hour about the neighborhood, about systemic inequality, about why financial literacy mattered more than charity. He'd listened in a way that felt rare, his full attention on her words, not her body, not her face. He hadn't told her his name was Hale. She'd learned that 2 weeks later, when she'd seen his photo in a news article about a high-profile arrest tied to organized crime. She should have run, but by then, she'd already seen the man beneath the reputation, the one who'd shown up 3 more Tuesdays in a row, the one who'd donated enough to keep the center running for a year, the one who'd asked her to coffee and listened like her thoughts mattered. When she'd confronted him about who he really was, he hadn't lied. "I'm not a good man by most standards," he'd said, his eyes steady on hers. "But I've never lied to you, Imani, and I won't start now." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to see me, not the name. Not the empire, just me." She had seen him, and against every logical instinct, she'd kept seeing him. Falling in love with Damien Hale had been a choice. Marrying him had been a negotiation. "I won't be a trophy," she'd told him the night he'd proposed, seated across from him in the tiny apartment she refused to leave. "I won't be paraded around for appearances. I won't be Victoria." "I'm not asking you to be," he'd said quietly. "I'm asking you to be my wife, not my accessory, my partner." "Then we do this my way," she'd said, "private, quiet. No one needs to know until we're ready." He'd agreed without hesitation, because Damien understood what the world had taught Imani. Visibility could be dangerous, not just because of his enemies, but because of theirs, the society gatekeepers who would tear her apart for daring to exist in spaces they believed she hadn't earned. So they'd married in secret. She'd kept her apartment, her job, her independence, and she'd loved him fiercely, privately, without needing the world's validation. But secrecy had a cost, too. Standing in the ballroom tonight, her uniform torn, her dignity intact, Imani had felt the weight of every whispered insult, every dismissive glance, every moment she'd been made to feel invisible. And she'd realized something. She was done hiding, not because she needed to prove herself to people like Victoria, not because she craved the spotlight, but because her silence had become complicity. By staying hidden, she'd allowed people to believe that she was ashamed, that her love was something to conceal. That her place beside Damien was somehow less legitimate than the woman who'd worn his name like a costume. Imani had spent her whole life being underestimated. She'd let people assume she was less intelligent because of her accent, less qualified because of her zip code, less worthy because of her skin. And she'd used it, turned their assumptions into armor. Let them underestimate her while she moved, strategized, survived. But there was a difference between strategy and surrender, and she was done surrendering. Later that night, after the ballroom had emptied and Damien had dealt with the immediate fallout, Imani stood alone in the private suite above Le Monarque. She'd removed the torn uniform, showered, dressed in her own clothes, simple, elegant, hers. She looked at herself in the mirror, her mother's daughter, Zara's protector, Damien's wife, not because anyone had given her permission, but because she'd claimed it. She thought of Victoria's face, twisted with rage and disbelief. She thought of the gasps, the stares, the shock, and she felt no satisfaction in their surprise, only resolve. "I will not be hidden anymore," she whispered to her reflection, not as a threat, as a promise. The world would see her now, not because Damien had spoken for her, but because she would speak for herself. And this time, she wouldn't whisper. By sunrise, the world knew. The video had gone viral within hours. Someone's phone had captured it all. Victoria's voice cutting through the ballroom, her hand reaching forward, the sickening sound of fabric tearing. Imani's stillness, the collective gasp, and then Damien. Emerging from the shadows like judgment itself, his voice low and lethal. "For what reason did you just lay your hands on my wife?" The clip had been posted, shared, screen-recorded, and dissected across every platform. Twitter threads dissected the power dynamics. Instagram stories froze on Imani's face, calm, unshaken, devastating in her dignity. TikTok exploded with reaction videos, their captions screaming variations of the same sentiment. She really thought she could humiliate her husband's real wife. The way he said, "my wife," I gasped. Karma in red heels. By morning, Le Monarque Gala was trending nationwide. But in Damien Hale's world, the world that operated in shadows and silence, the response was far more dangerous than hashtags. In a penthouse overlooking the Hudson, Marcus Levine watched the video for the third time, a thin smile playing at his lips. "So, the rumors were true," he murmured to the man standing beside him. "Hale's got himself a new wife." "A black girl from Brooklyn," his associate added, scrolling through a dossier on his tablet. "Imani Carter, no criminal record, works in financial consulting, volunteers at community centers." Marcus chuckled, low and dark. "A conscience, how quaint." "You think it's a weakness? I think it's an opportunity." Across the city, similar conversations were happening in boardrooms and back rooms, in private clubs and penthouse suites. The families that operated in Damien's orbit were all asking the same questions. Who was this woman? What did she know? And more importantly, could she be used? Some saw Imani as a liability. A soft spot in Damien's armor, something that could be exploited, threatened, leveraged. Others saw something more troubling, a queen rising. The old guard whispered about disrespect, about Damien airing private business in public, about the dangers of letting outsiders into their world. But the younger wolves saw strategy. They saw a man powerful enough to do what he wanted, when he wanted, and to hell with anyone who questioned him. And they saw a woman who'd stood in the center of a storm and hadn't flinched. In a world where image was currency, Imani Carter had just become invaluable. The power balance was shifting, and everyone with eyes could see it. Victoria didn't sleep. She'd spent the night pacing her suite at the estate, technically still hers, though she wasn't sure for how much longer, deleting notifications, blocking accounts, watching her social media mentions turn into a wildfire she couldn't control. The comments were vicious. She got what she deserved. Imagine thinking you can treat people like that. The audacity of ripping someone's clothes and then finding out. She threw her phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor. Screen cracked. The sun was barely up when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate. Damien. The door opened without a knock. He stepped inside, still wearing the suit from the night before. His tie loosened, his expression carved from stone. Victoria stood, smoothing her robe, forcing her breathing to steady. She needed to be smart now. Strategic. "Damien," she started, her voice softer than usual. "We need to talk about last night." "No," he interrupted, his tone flat. "You need to listen." She blinked, caught off guard by the ice in his voice. He crossed the room slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes never leaving hers. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I made a mistake," Victoria said quickly, the words practiced. "I had too much to drink. I was emotional. You know, I didn't mean—" "You meant every word." His voice cut through her excuses like a blade. "You wanted to humiliate her, in front of everyone." Victoria's jaw tightened. She was hovering around the table like she was doing her job? Damien's eyes flashed. "Or did you forget? That was the role I asked her to play." Victoria's breath hitched. She hadn't known that, but she recovered quickly, pivoting. "How was I supposed to know who she was? You never told me you'd remarried." "Because it's none of your concern." The words landed like a slap. Victoria stared at him, something cold unfurling in her chest. "None of my concern. I'm your wife, Damien." "No." His voice was quiet, lethal. "You're my ex-wife. The papers were filed 6 months ago. You've been stalling the signatures, but that doesn't change what we both know." Her hands trembled. She hid them behind her back. "You kept me around for appearances," she said bitterly. "You used me." "And you used me," Damien countered, stepping closer. "For the name, the money, the status. Don't pretend this was ever about love, Victoria. We both knew what it was." She wanted to argue, to scream, but the truth was too loud to deny. "But last night," Damien continued, his voice dropping, "you crossed a line. I didn't know. It doesn't matter. His eyes were merciless. You put your hands on someone you believed was beneath you. You tore her clothes. You tried to humiliate her because you thought she was powerless. Victoria's face flushed. I was angry. You were cruel. Damien's voice hardened. And you didn't just embarrass yourself. You embarrassed my wife. The possessiveness in those final two words was unmistakable. Victoria felt something crack inside her. So that's it? You're choosing her over me? I chose her the moment I married her. Silence swallowed the room. Victoria's vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, refusing to cry in front of him. What happens now? Damien's expression didn't soften. You have 72 hours to vacate the estate. You'll receive a settlement. Generous, because I'm not vindictive. But you will sign the divorce papers, and you will do it quietly. And if I don't? His smile was cold. Then I stop being generous. Victoria's throat tightened. She'd seen that look before. The one that reminded her exactly who Damien Hale was. Not the man she'd married. Not the trophy husband she'd paraded around. The man who ended problems. You can't just throw me out, she whispered, her voice shaking. I can, and I am. He turned toward the door, his hand on the knob, then paused. For what it's worth, he said without looking back. You could have left with dignity, but you chose this. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Victoria stood alone in the center of the room, her reflection staring back at her from the mirror across the way. She looked the same as she always had, beautiful, polished, perfect. But everything beneath the surface was crumbling, and for the first time in her life, Victoria Hale realized she had nothing left to stand on. In a world built on perception and power, nothing stayed secret for long. By the second day after the gala, Damien's phone hadn't stopped ringing, not from journalists, those he ignored, but from the people who mattered in his world, the ones who operated in whispers and wire transfers, who built empires on fear and loyalty. They all wanted the same thing, to understand what Imani Carter meant. Some called to offer congratulations, their voices smooth with subtext. Others called with thinly veiled warnings, reminding him that family business stayed in the family, and outsiders were liabilities. Damien had expected this. What he hadn't expected was the meeting Marcus Levine requested. They met at a private club in Midtown, the kind with no sign on the door, and memberships passed down through generations. Damien arrived flanked by two of his men, but Marcus was already seated in the back corner, alone, a glass of scotch catching the low light. "Hail," Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Congratulations on the marriage. I had no idea you were such a romantic." Damien sat, his expression neutral. "What do you want, Marcus?" "Just to talk." Marcus leaned back, his smile thin. "You've caused quite a stir. The old guard is concerned. The old guard is always concerned." "True." Marcus swirled his drink. "But usually not about their associates airing personal matters in public, especially when those matters involve new vulnerabilities." Damien's eyes hardened. "Careful." I'm not threatening, Marcus said smoothly. I'm observing. Your new wife. She's lovely by all accounts. Educated. Principled. But she's also visible now. And visibility in our world? That's dangerous. She can handle herself. I'm sure she can. Marcus set down his glass. But the question isn't whether she can handle herself. It's whether you can handle what comes with protecting her. Damien stood, buttoning his suit jacket. If you have something to say it. Marcus smiled. Just this. Not everyone sees your wife as an asset. Some see an opening, a pressure point. You've built an empire on control, Damien. Make sure you haven't just handed your enemies the one thing you can't afford to lose. Damien didn't respond. He turned and walked out, his jaw tight, Marcus's words echoing in his mind. Back at his office, Damien found his lieutenant, Vincent Torres, waiting. Vincent had been with him for over a decade, loyal, ruthless, and brutally honest. He stood when Damien entered, his expression grave. We need to talk about the fallout, Vincent said without preamble. Damien poured himself a drink. Go ahead. Victoria's outburst has rattled people. Not just the public, our people. They're wondering if you're losing focus. My focus is fine. With respect, boss, it doesn't look that way. Vincent's tone was firm. You revealed your marriage at a public event. You humiliated your ex-wife in front of half the city's elite. That's not control. That's emotion. Damien's eyes flashed. She put her hands on my wife, and you made it personal. Vincent stepped closer. I'm not saying she didn't deserve it. I'm saying it sends a message. People are asking questions about Imani, about whether she's a weakness. She's not. Then prove it. Vincent's voice softened. Let us protect her. Full detail. Security on her apartment, her office, everywhere she goes. Damien set down his glass. I already offered. She refused. Vincent's eyebrows shot up. She what? She said she's done hiding, that she won't live like a prisoner. Vincent exhaled slowly. Boss, you know what that means. If she's out there, exposed, I know exactly what it means, Damien interrupted, his voice edged with frustration. And I'm not going to force her into a cage to make everyone else comfortable. Vincent studied him for a long moment. You love her? It wasn't a question. Damien met his gaze. More than anything. Then you need to understand something, Vincent said quietly. In this world, love is the most dangerous weapon someone can use against you. And right now, everyone knows exactly where to aim. Across town, in a boutique hotel room she'd checked into under a false name, Victoria sat at the desk with her laptop open and a bottle of wine half empty beside her. She'd spent the past 2 days digging. Imani Carter wasn't hard to research. She'd lived a public enough life before Damien. NYU graduate, financial consultant, volunteer, a sister named Zara still living in Brooklyn. Victoria's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She could ruin this girl, leak her address, her routines, her vulnerabilities. In Damien's world, Information was currency, and Victoria still had contacts, people who owed her favors, people who would be very interested to know that Damien Hale's new wife walked around the city with minimal protection, still going to her old coffee shop on Sunday mornings, still visiting her sister in a neighborhood with no security cameras. It would be so easy. One phone call. One whisper in the right ear. She could make Imani Carter a target. Victoria stared at the screen, her heart pounding, her mind racing. Damien had humiliated her, cast her aside like she was nothing. She deserved this, didn't she? Victoria's hand moved toward her phone. Imani left her apartment at 7:30 in the evening, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder, her hair pulled back in a low bun. She'd spent the day fielding calls from friends, from Zara, from colleagues who'd seen the video. Everyone wanted to know if she was okay, if she needed anything, if she was safe. She'd told them all the same thing. She was fine. And she was. Damien had offered her a security detail, a driver, a new apartment in a building with 24-hour doormen and bulletproof glass. She'd declined. Not out of stubbornness, though she had plenty of that, but out of principle. She had spent her entire life navigating dangerous spaces. She knew how to move through the world, how to stay aware, how to trust her instincts. She wasn't going to stop living her life because someone might see her as a target. She walked down the front steps of her building, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The bodega on the corner glowed warm and familiar. A group of kids played on the stoop across the street. This was her neighborhood, her life, and she wouldn't let fear take it from her. But as she turned the corner toward the subway, she didn't notice the black sedan parked half a block down, engine idling, or the man in the driver's seat, watching her through tinted windows. He lifted a phone to his ear. "Target confirmed," he said quietly. "She's alone." On the other end of the line, a voice responded, low, measured, patient. "Good. Don't move yet. Just watch. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she sees." The man in the sedan nodded. Understood. He ended the call and settled back in his seat, his eyes never leaving Imani's retreating figure. In the shadows, patience was a predator's greatest weapon, and the hunt had already begun. The attack came on a Thursday night. Imani was 3 blocks from her apartment, returning from Zara's place with leftovers in a plastic bag when she felt it. The prickle of awareness that came from years of navigating unsafe spaces. Footsteps behind her. Too close, too synchronized. She didn't turn around, didn't speed up. She adjusted the bag in her hand and mentally mapped the distance to the nearest bodega, the one with the owner who knew her name. 2 more blocks. The footsteps quickened. Imani's pulse spiked. She turned sharply into an alley she knew had an exit on the other side. A shortcut she'd used 100 times. But tonight, someone was waiting. 2 men, faces hidden behind black masks, stepped out from the shadows ahead of her. One held a knife, the other a length of pipe. "Easy now," the one with the knife said, his voice muffled. "Just come with us. Don't make this difficult." Imani's mind raced. She tightened her grip on the plastic bag, her keys threaded between her fingers in her pocket. The self-defense trick her mother had taught her at 15. "I don't have much cash," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "But you can take my phone. We're not here for your phone." The men behind her had closed in. She was boxed. Imani's heart hammered, but she kept her breathing even. She'd been afraid before. Fear didn't mean helpless. The man with the knife stepped forward, and then a gunshot cracked through the air. Not a kill shot. A warning. The bullet struck the brick wall 6 inches from the man's head. He froze. From the mouth of the alley, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, his weapon trained with steady precision. "Step away from her," the man said, his voice calm and absolute. It was Lucas, one of Damien's personal guards. The masked men exchanged a glance. For a heartbeat, Imani thought they might try anyway. Then Lucas fired again, this time at the ground near their feet. They ran. Lucas didn't chase them. He crossed the alley in 3 strides, his eyes scanning Imani quickly. "You hurt?" She shook her head, her breath coming faster now that the danger had passed. "I'm fine. What are you doing here?" "Mr. Hale had someone watching your route," Lucas said, lowering his weapon. "You might have refused a detail, but he wasn't taking chances." Imani's jaw tightened, a cocktail of gratitude and frustration swirling in her chest. "I didn't ask." "You didn't have to." Lucas's expression softened slightly. "Come on, we need to get you somewhere safe." Damien was already in motion by the time Lucas's call came through. He'd been in a meeting with his accountant when his phone buzzed. A single message from Lucas. "Incident. She's safe." Bringing her in. The meeting had ended in seconds. Now, in his private office at the downtown building he used for secure matters, Damien stood with his hands braced on the desk, his jaw locked tight as Lucas recounted the attempted abduction. Imani sat on the leather couch across the room, a blanket around her shoulders she hadn't asked for, her eyes sharp and alert. "They weren't trying to rob her," Lucas finished. "They wanted to take her. Alive." Damien's knuckles went white. "How many?" "4 total. 2 ahead, 2 behind. Coordinated." "And you got a look at them?" "Faces covered, but one of them spoke. I might recognize the voice if I hear it again." Damien straightened, his mind already running through possibilities. Rivals, competitors, people who wanted leverage, or someone closer. He turned to Vincent, who'd arrived minutes earlier. "Pull footage from every camera within a 6-block radius. I want faces, plates, anything." Vincent nodded and left. Damien crossed to Imani, crouching in front of her, his hands resting gently on her knees. "You sure you're aware?" "I'm fine," she said, and she meant it. Shaken, but fine. His thumb traced a slow circle on her leg, grounding himself as much as her. "This is why I wanted protection on you." "I know. And you're still going to refuse it, aren't you?" She met his eyes. "We'll talk about it." It was the closest to a concession she'd give, and Damien knew better than to push. He kissed her forehead and stood. "I'll find who did this." "I know you will," Imani said quietly. And she also knew what that meant. The trace took less than 12 hours. One of the men had been sloppy, used a phone registered to a cousin with priors. That cousin had worked security for events at Le Monarque, and he'd been hired by someone with connections to Victoria. When Vincent laid the information on Damien's desk, the room went cold. "You're sure?" Damien asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Burner phone records show 3 calls to her hotel in the last 48 hours, Vincent confirmed. "Could be coincidence, but it's not." Damien stood, buttoning his jacket. "Where is she?" "Still at the estate. Packing, supposedly." Damien's smile was sharp and humorless. "Not anymore." Victoria heard him coming before she saw him. The door to her suite slammed open hard enough to crack against the wall. She spun, her heart lurching, and found Damien standing in the doorway like a storm made flesh. "What the hell were you thinking?" His voice was low, lethal. Victoria's hands trembled. "I don't know what you're—" "Don't!" He crossed the room in seconds, stopping inches from her. "2 men tried to abduct Imani last night. The trail leads back to you." Victoria's face drained of color. "I didn't. I never told anyone to hurt her." "But you made calls," Damien said, "to people you knew would ask questions, to people who operate outside the law. You put a target on her back." "I was angry." Victoria's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. "She took everything from me." "She didn't take anything," Damien snapped. "I gave it to her, because she earned it, because she's everything you never were." Victoria flinched like she'd been slapped. "You want to know when I stopped loving you?" Damien's voice was ice. "It wasn't when I met Imani. It was at that gala. When you tore a shirt to prove she was nobody. That's when I saw who you really were." Tears streaked down Victoria's face, her makeup smudging. "She stole my place, my life, my husband. I was never yours," Damien said coldly. "I was a name you wore, a status you clung to. But you never knew me, and you sure as hell never loved me." Victoria's knees buckled. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands covering her face. Damien pulled out his phone and made a call. "Send them up." Within seconds, 2 guards appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Hale is leaving," Damien said without looking at her. "Immediately. Escort her out. She's not welcome here again." Victoria's head snapped up. "You can't do this." "This time, it's not your reputation on the line," Damien said quietly. "It's your life. If I find out you had any direct involvement in last night, there won't be anywhere far enough for you to run." The guards stepped forward. Victoria stood shakily, her world collapsing around her. "I have nowhere to go. That's not my problem anymore." The guards took her by the arms, not rough, but firm. As they led her toward the door, she looked back one last time. Damien had already turned away. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the empty suite. And just like that, Victoria Hale became a ghost in the empire she'd once tried to rule. 3 weeks after the attack, Imani Carter walked through the front entrance of Le Monarque on Damien Hale's arm. This time she wasn't wearing a server's uniform. The gown was midnight blue, Simple in design but devastating in execution, custom-tailored to fit her like it had been painted on, the fabric catching the light with every step. Her natural hair was styled in elegant twists swept to one side, diamond earrings glinting at her ears. She wore minimal makeup. She didn't need it. She was breathtaking. But more than that, she was present, fully, unapologetically present. The doorman's eyes widened slightly when he saw her, recognition flickering across his face. He'd been working the night of the incident. He opened the door with a deeper bow than usual. "Mrs. Hale," he said respectfully. Imani smiled. "Good evening, Thomas." Inside, the ballroom had been transformed for the charity gala. The same space where she'd been humiliated now glowing with warmth and purpose. Tonight's event was hers. She'd organized it, down to the last detail. An evening for equity, supporting women in service industries. Every ticket sold benefited a fund she'd established for childcare, education, and emergency assistance for workers, housekeepers, servers, caregivers, the people who kept the world running but were rarely seen. As Imani and Damien entered, conversations quieted. Heads turned, and then one by one people began to stand. It started at the nearest table, a group of business leaders Damien had worked with for years. Then it spread, table by table, like a wave. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. Not for Damien, for her. Imani's breath caught, but she didn't falter. She held her head high and walked through the center aisle, Damien's hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Supportive, not possessive. She wasn't his accessory. She was his equal. They reached the head table, and the room slowly settled back into their seats, the energy shifting from shock to something else. Respect. The evening unfolded with a grace Imani had orchestrated carefully. Dinner was served by a staff she'd personally met with beforehand, thanking each of them by name, ensuring they were paid above standard rate and offered full benefits for the night. Between courses, a video played on the screens around the room. Testimonials from women whose lives had been changed by programs like the one tonight's funds would support. A single mother who'd gone back to school. A housekeeper who'd started her own cleaning business. A waitress who'd survived an abusive relationship and rebuilt her life. The room was silent except for the voices on screen. When the video ended, Imani stood. She walked to the podium at the front of the room, the spotlight finding her. And for just a heartbeat, she thought of the last time she'd stood in this space, uniform torn, dignity intact, the world watching. She thought of every time she'd been invisible, every dismissive glance, every assumption. And then she began to speak. "Good evening," Imani said, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Imani Carter Hale. Some of you know me, many of you don't. But a few weeks ago, you saw me." A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. "I was wearing a different outfit that night," she continued, a faint smile touching her lips. "And I was treated the way too many women in service positions are treated every day, as if we're invisible, as if our work, our dignity, our humanity doesn't matter." She paused, letting the words settle. "But here's what I learned that night, and what I've known my whole life. Being underestimated is not the same as being powerless. Murmurs of agreement. The women we're here to support tonight are the backbone of this city. They raise children while working double shifts. They clean offices and serve meals and care for the elderly, often for wages that don't reflect the value of their labor. They are skilled, resilient, and deserving of every opportunity we take for granted. Her eyes swept the room. So tonight, I'm asking you to see them, not as invisible hands that make your life easier, but as people, mothers, sisters, daughters, women who deserve dignity, safety, and a fair chance. The applause started before she finished, building into a standing ovation that filled the ballroom like thunder. Imani smiled, her heart full, and returned to her seat beside Damien. He leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're incredible." "I'm just getting started," she whispered back. Outside, across the street in the shadow of a boutique storefront, Victoria stood with her coat pulled tight against the autumn chill. She'd told herself she wouldn't come, but she couldn't stay away. Through the tall windows of Le Monarque, she could see everything: the glittering crowd, the lights, the screens showing Imani's face as she spoke. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the reactions, the applause, the respect, the way people looked at Imani like she mattered. Victoria's hands clenched inside her pockets. That should have been her. That room, that applause, that life, but she'd thrown it away. No, she'd torn it apart with her own hands, the same way she'd torn Imani's shirt. And now she was standing on the outside, looking in, with nowhere left to go. She'd signed the divorce papers, taken the settlement, generous, as Damien had promised. But it felt like a consolation prize. She'd moved into a small apartment in a neighborhood she used to mock. Her social media was still flooded with comments. Her friends, the ones who'd only ever been there for the proximity to power, had stopped calling. She was alone, and it was entirely her own fault. Victoria watched as Damien leaned toward Imani, his expression soft in a way she'd never seen him look at her. Watched as Imani laughed, radiant and unguarded. She felt something crack inside her chest, not anger this time, but something worse. Grief. For the woman she could have been, if she'd chosen differently. Victoria turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, disappearing into the city that had already forgotten her name. Later that night, in the back of the limousine, Imani rested her head against Damien's shoulder, exhausted but content. The gala had raised 3 times the projected amount. The fund was fully established. Women across the city would have access to resources they desperately needed. She'd done it, not by demanding attention, but by earning it. Damien's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "You know what I realized tonight?" he said quietly. "What?" "You were never nobody," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They just couldn't see you." Imani smiled, her eyes closing. "They see me now." "Yes," Damien agreed. "They do." And as the city lights blurred past the window, Imani felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Not vindication, not victory, just peace she had reclaimed her space, not with cruelty or revenge, but with grace. And that, she knew, was the most powerful statement of all. Chapter 9. Not the end, but a beginning. Approx 1,000 words. Morning light spilled across the terrace of the Hale penthouse, painting the skyline in soft golds and silvers. The city buzzed below, unaware of the quiet shift taking place above it. Not in power, but in presence. Imani Carter Hale stood barefoot on the marble balcony, wrapped in a silk robe the color of deep plum. Her hair, no longer confined to tight buns or subdued styles, flowed freely in soft coils down her back. In her hand, a glass of water, half full and untouched. She wasn't thinking about what came next. Not yet. She was simply breathing. 3 weeks had passed since the gala. The night everything changed. Not just for her, but for how she was seen. And more importantly, for how she saw herself. No longer playing small in borrowed spaces, no longer shrinking into silence to make others comfortable. She'd built something, not just a charity fund, but a presence, a life. Inside, Damien moved through the penthouse's quiet with ease, phone in one hand, espresso in the other. Business hadn't stopped. It never did in his world. But something had softened in him, not weakness, never that. It was a quieting of the need to dominate every room, now that someone shared the space beside him who never needed to be dominated. She joined him in the kitchen, accepting a warm kiss to her temple before he returned to his call. "You're the face now, boss," his lieutenant said on speaker, a half-joking tone in his voice. "They don't even ask about Victoria anymore. You've got senators asking Imani for brunch." Damien didn't smile. But his eyes flicked to his wife, who was casually flipping through a folder of new proposals for her foundation. "Good," he said. "They should." Some in Damien's world still whispered. Men who measured worth in brutality, who saw Imani's grace as softness. But they didn't matter. They couldn't see what Damien had always known. Her strength ran deeper than any weapon, and her presence held a room longer than fear ever could. Across the city, in a modest apartment nestled between a dry cleaner and a bakery, Victoria Hale stared at an envelope resting on her kitchen table. Her name was written in Damien's hand. Precise. Final. She'd known it would come eventually, but seeing it, feeling it, was something else. She slid it open carefully, as if the paper might cut her on its own. Inside were the finalized divorce papers, clean, binding, and a single handwritten note on Hale family stationery. Power isn't worn. It's earned. That was all. No insults, no cruelty. Just truth. Victoria let the letter fall back into the envelope and leaned back in the creaky kitchen chair. The silence was louder than any ballroom applause. She looked around her apartment, sparse, cold, functional, and for the first time in a long time, didn't blame anyone else for where she'd landed. She'd torn her own world apart, thread by arrogant thread. Back at the penthouse, Imani slipped into a navy sheath dress and minimalist heels. Today, she had a luncheon with women from the foundation. Not donors, but recipients. housekeepers, nurses, single mothers, women who reminded her of the girl she used to be, hustling from job to job with tired eyes and no safety net. Damien kissed her hand before she left. "Call me if anything feels off," he said. "I will," she promised. "But I've got this." And she did. That afternoon, Imani sat in a sunlit room surrounded by stories. One woman talked about escaping an abusive marriage. Another shared how she'd paid off her tuition in full. A third had started her own catering business and just landed her first corporate contract. They weren't looking at Imani like she was some untouchable socialite. They looked at her like one of their own. That night, as dusk rolled in and the skyline glimmered under a canopy of city lights, Imani stood once more on the balcony, alone, content. She sipped a glass of wine, her eyes drifting to the street below. Somewhere down there, people were still underestimating women like her. Assuming quiet meant powerless. Assuming dignity meant weakness. Assuming invisibility was a given. She let them assume. Inside, Damien watched her from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. When she turned, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her in gently. "You ever think about that night?" he asked. "The one where she tore your shirt?" Imani leaned her head against his chest. "Sometimes," she said. "Not with anger anymore. Just gratitude. Gratitude." She nodded. "She tried to tear me down instead. She revealed who I really was." They stood in silence for a moment, breathing in the quiet. No need to fill the space with noise. Imani looked out again at the world before her. Not as a server, not as a secret, not as a shadow, but as a woman who had earned her place, not through revenge, but through restraint, resilience, and truth. The story that began with torn fabric ended not with vengeance, but with vision. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And this time, she would not be unseen. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.